What if I told you that one of the most profitable films in cinema history was rejected by every Hollywood studio, not because it was bad, but because it was too good? That powerful executives refused to touch a project that would become a cultural phenomenon, earning over $600 million. And that behind this rejection existed something much larger than simply business decisions. The story of Hollywood's refusal to finance The Passion of the Christ isn't just about money or commercial risks. It's about an invisible battle that took place behind the scenes of the film industry, a silent war between completely opposing worldviews. Mel Gibson knew this from the beginning, but what he didn't imagine was how far this opposition would go and how many doors would need to close before the truth could finally come to light. In the early 2000s, Mel Gibson wasn't just any director trying to sell a script. He was a Hollywood superstar, winner of the Oscar for Best Picture and Best Director for Braveheart in 1995, responsible for some of the biggest box office hits of previous decades. When a man of this caliber presents a project, studios normally line up to finance it. But with The Passion of the Christ, exactly the opposite happened. Room after room, meeting after meeting, the answer was always the same: no. Initially, 20th Century Fox showed interest and even closed a distribution deal. But when the script leaked and groups began to protest publicly, accusing the work still in pre-production of anti-Semitism, Fox backed down. The studio that had previously worked with Gibson simply disappeared, leaving the director alone. In an interview with Hollywood Reporter in 2002, Gibson revealed with rare frankness, "This is a film about something nobody wants to touch, filmed in 2 dead languages. In Los Angeles they think I'm crazy, and maybe I am." But the real question wasn't Gibson's madness. It was Hollywood's fear. Fear of what, exactly? The official answer was always commercial. A film entirely in Aramaic and Latin, without known stars, portraying extreme graphic violence and focusing on the last 12 hours of Jesus Christ, simply had no market appeal. Executives claimed that nobody would pay admission to watch something so heavy, so religious, so specific. Some called the project a time bomb and predicted it would be the end of Gibson's career. The New York Times, the day after the premiere, publicly prophesied that the film would mean the director's professional collapse and called for a massive boycott. But if it was just a commercial matter, why so much emotional resistance? Why so many personal attacks against Gibson before even a single scene was filmed? In January 2025, during his appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience podcast, Mel Gibson finally came clean about what he really faced. There was a lot of opposition, he admitted, with a calm that contrasts with the intensity of what he went through. The idea was to show that we're all responsible for that his sacrifice was for all humanity, for all our sins and all things in our fallen nature. It was for our redemption. I believe that. Joe Rogan, an atheist raised as a Catholic, agreed with Gibson and raised a crucial point. Christianity is the only religion you're allowed to belittle. Hollywood is full of progressive and open-minded left-leaning people who can embrace various religions. But Christianity, for whatever reason, whatever it represents, is negative. This observation touches the nerve of the matter. The rejection wasn't about commercial viability. It was ideological, cultural, spiritual. If you seek to understand the divine mysteries that happen around us, don't forget to like, subscribe and share in the comments your own spiritual experiences that may have connection with what you're about to discover. The campaign against The Passion of the Christ began before the film existed. In 2003, when the project was still known only as The Passion, an organized group of Jewish citizens went directly to Fox's offices to dissuade the studio from distributing the film. The argument was clear. The content suggested that the Jewish people carried collective guilt for the death of Jesus Christ. In February 2004, the Anti-Defamation League and the American Conference of Catholic Bishops had access to the script before the premiere. They issued a devastating statement, characterizing the plot as one of the most problematic texts in terms of anti-Semitic potential that they had ever seen in the last 25 years. The narrative, according to these entities, portrayed Christ being relentlessly persecuted by a malevolent Jewish conspiracy led by High Priest Caiaphas, who would have blackmailed Pontius Pilate to condemn Jesus to death. The statement went further, affirming that this was precisely the story that fed centuries of anti-Semitism in Christian societies, and that it was a plot rejected by the Roman Catholic Church at Vatican II in its document Nostra Aetate. Gibson was described as a fringe Catholic who is building his own church in the Los Angeles area and who apparently accepts neither the teachings of Vatican II nor modern biblical scholarship. The accusations were serious, but there was something strange about all this. The film wasn't ready yet. Nobody had seen the final version. The script had been obtained questionably, leaked to create exactly this type of pressure. And yet, the campaign was devastating enough to make no major Hollywood studio want to get involved in the project. Gibson was left alone. The decision that Mel Gibson made at that moment defines not only the fate of the film, but reveals something about the character of the man. Instead of compromising his vision, instead of softening the script to appease critics, instead of giving up in the face of unprecedented pressure, he did something that very few in Hollywood would have the courage to do. He financed the entire film out of his own pocket. $30 million in production costs, another $15 million in marketing, $45 million total, all his, without a safety net, without a studio to share the loss in case everything went wrong. If the film failed, it wouldn't just be a cinematic failure. It would be a personal financial catastrophe and the definitive end of his reputation in the industry. Sometimes we wonder what exists beyond our physical world, and other times strange things happen that make us question everything we thought about life. In situations like these, a better understanding can mean the difference between being confused and having clarity. That's exactly what our ebook, The Secret of Jesus' Apparitions, offers. Consider acquiring this incredible material for a symbolic value. This exclusive material offers keys to decipher divine signs and understand how Christ manifests in our days. Your contribution allows us to maintain this independent research work. The link to acquire the material is available in the pinned comment. To understand the magnitude of this decision, one must consider the context. Gibson wasn't just a filmmaker following a creative intuition. He was in spiritual warfare with himself. In the late 1990s, he had gone through a profound personal crisis, struggling with addictions, depression, and destructive thoughts that nearly led him to suicide. It was at that rock bottom that something happened, something he described as a visceral re-encounter with his Catholic faith. He began to meditate obsessively on the Gospels, especially on the passages about Christ's suffering, and it was there in that personal darkness that the idea of the Passion of the Christ was born. "I was a bad guy, a really horrible guy," Gibson admitted years later. "My sins were the first to nail him to the cross. So I wanted to tell his story." It wasn't a vanity project, it was a redemption mission. But financing the film alone was just the beginning. Gibson had another equally complicated problem: distributing the film without Hollywood's support. To avoid exposing other studios to the same type of defamatory campaign he was facing, and to protect potential distributors from intense public criticism, Gibson decided to distribute the film independently in the United States with the help of a smaller company called Newmarket Films. Newmarket would only help with the logistics of shipping copies to theaters and collecting revenues. Everything else, including the marketing strategy, would be Gibson's responsibility. And it was here that he made another brilliant decision that would completely change the game. Instead of following Hollywood's traditional marketing formula with big advertising campaigns on television, press conferences, and interviews on talk shows, Gibson did something radically different. He went straight to the churches. Gibson and his team began organizing private screenings of the film for evangelical leaders, Catholic priests and Christian influencers across the country. Not in Beverly Hills or in sophisticated New York movie theaters, but in church basements, community halls and religious conference centers. Pastors watched the film, many crying openly during the flagellation and crucifixion scenes, and then returned to their congregations with an urgent message. This wasn't just another movie about Jesus. It was the most powerful, most visceral, most faithful representation of Christ's real suffering that had ever been put on screen. Something began to happen then that Hollywood couldn't understand or control. The churches mobilized. Religious groups began reserving entire theaters for their congregations. Pastors built sermons around the release date. Buses were chartered to transport believers to theaters. For many American Christians, watching The Passion of the Christ wasn't a common cinematic experience. It was a spiritual event, almost sacramental. And then came the release day, Wednesday, February 25, 2004, Ash Wednesday. The choice of date was no coincidence. Gibson wanted the film to open at the beginning of Lent, the 40-day period of reflection and repentance that precedes Easter in the Christian calendar. Critics sharpened their knives. The New York Times had practically declared the film dead before it reached theaters. Market analysts predicted mediocre performance, perhaps $20 or $30 million in the entire exhibition cycle, if lucky. Nobody expected what happened. On the first day, The Passion of the Christ earned $23.5 million. By the end of the first weekend, the film had generated $83.8 million, breaking all records for a February opening and becoming the biggest launch of all time for that month. Hollywood was in absolute shock. How was this possible? A film rated as restricted, entirely subtitled, extremely violent, without famous stars, about a religious theme that supposedly nobody wanted to see, was crushing the competition. But what really left studio executives perplexed was that the film didn't stop. Week after week, The Passion of the Christ continued filling theaters. Entire families went together. People who hadn't frequented cinemas in years left home to watch. Many returned multiple times. Reports began to emerge of viewers fainting, vomiting, or leaving the rooms in tears because of the intensity of the torture scenes. But they came back and brought others. By the end of its theatrical run, The Passion of the Christ had earned $370.8 million in the United States alone and over $611 million worldwide. A return of over 1,300% on the investment. The film became not only the most profitable independent production in history, but also the highest-grossing R-rated film of all time in the United States, a record that stands to this day. So what was the real reason for Hollywood's rejection? Why did powerful executives who live to profit from successful films reject a project that would become one of the greatest commercial success stories in cinema history? The official answer always revolved around three main arguments: commercial risk, anti-Semitic controversy, and excessive violence. But when you analyze each of these arguments carefully, they begin to crumble. The commercial risk argument made no sense for a man like Mel Gibson. He had just directed Braveheart, a violent historical epic that earned over $200 million and won 5 Oscars. He had proven credibility both artistically and commercially. If any director could make a niche film work, it was Gibson. Moreover, he was offering to finance the entire film alone. The studios wouldn't need to risk a penny. They only needed to distribute the film and take a percentage of the profits. It was literally free money. And yet, they said no. But there was something even deeper happening, something few were willing to admit publicly. In an interview kept in more restricted circles, a studio executive who requested anonymity revealed, "Mel was doing something that we, as an industry, worked decades to deconstruct. He was presenting Christ as a real historical figure. his suffering as literal and necessary, and the sacrifice as universally significant. That goes against everything Hollywood represents today. We sell narratives where each person is their own god, where truth is relative, where suffering is always unjust and should be avoided. Mel was saying the opposite. He was saying that absolute truth exists, that suffering can have divine purpose, that we need redemption outside ourselves. That's dangerous for the kind of world we're trying to build. These words, spoken privately but later leaked, reveal the true battlefield. It wasn't about money, it wasn't about cultural sensitivities, it wasn't about cinematic violence. It was about worldviews at war. Hollywood had become not just an entertainment industry, but a social engineering machine, shaping narratives that promote certain values and suppress others. And The Passion of the Christ, with its unfiltered presentation of the gospel, represented a direct threat to that agenda. Mel Gibson, perhaps without fully realizing it at first, had touched an exposed nerve. He wasn't just making a movie. He was challenging an entire belief system that had captured Hollywood. Hollywood's rejection of The Passion of the Christ wasn't just a business decision. It was an act of spiritual warfare disguised as corporate pragmatism. And the evidence of this invisible battle began to appear in ways nobody could have predicted. It started with personal attacks on Mel Gibson. As soon as the project was publicly announced, reporters began digging up anything they could use against him. Gibson's family past was relentlessly scrutinized. His father, Hutton Gibson, had made controversial statements about the Holocaust in radio interviews, claiming that much of it was fiction and that museums dedicated to the genocide were a trick to make money. These statements from the father were immediately attributed to the son, even without any evidence that Mel shared those views. Actress Winona Ryder came forward publicly years later, alleging that Gibson had made anti-Semitic and homophobic comments at a party in 1996. Gibson vehemently denied through his representatives, saying she lied about the incident, but the story had already circulated widely. Every old Gibson interview was re-examined, every sentence analyzed for signs of prejudice. What's remarkable isn't that Gibson has a problematic past, many people in Hollywood do, but the selective ferocity with which he was attacked. Directors who had made far more controversial films, actors with far more disturbing personal histories, producers with serious criminal allegations, all continued working normally in Hollywood. But Gibson, for making a film about Jesus, became the target of an unprecedented reputation destruction campaign. In 2006, 2 years after the success of The Passion, Gibson was arrested for drunk driving. During the arrest, he made horrible anti-Semitic comments to the officer who detained him, saying that Jews were responsible for all the wars in the world. Gibson later publicly apologized, admitting he was completely out of control and that his words were despicable and didn't reflect his true beliefs. But the damage was done. The incident was used retroactively to validate all previous accusations against the film, as if Gibson's personal fall 2 years later proved that the film had always been motivated by hate. The question few are willing to ask is, why this collective punishment? If the film was just another cinematic interpretation of the Gospels, why was the reaction so visceral and lasting? The answer, according to those who study the intersection between faith and culture, is that The Passion of the Christ represented something far more threatening than Hollywood was willing to admit. It wasn't just a film about Jesus, it was a film that reaffirmed the historical and theological centrality of Christ in a way that secular culture had spent decades trying to deconstruct. It was a film that presented suffering as redemptive, sacrifice as necessary, and truth as absolute. In a postmodern era where everything is relative, where each person is encouraged to be their own moral author, where suffering is always pathological and must be eliminated through therapy or medication, The Passion of the Christ was saying something radically different. It was saying that some truths are universal, that some suffering has divine purpose, that we desperately need something greater than ourselves. And Hollywood, which had become not just an entertainment industry but one of the main architects of modern cultural narrative, couldn't allow that message to prosper without consequences. Allowing the Passion of the Christ to succeed without punishing those involved would be admitting that there's a huge audience desperate for content that affirms their traditional Christian beliefs. It would be admitting that decades of secular social engineering hadn't eliminated the spiritual hunger of the masses. It would be admitting defeat in a culture war that Hollywood thought it was winning. And so the punishment had to be exemplary. Gibson had to become a pariah. Caviezel had to be exiled. Everyone involved had to pay a visible price to send a clear message to any other filmmaker considering doing something similar. We control the narratives here, and challenging that control has consequences. Sources close to power circles in Hollywood reveal that explicit conversations occurred in executive boardrooms after the unexpected success of The Passion. A veteran producer who was present at one of these confidential meetings confided, "They were in panic. It wasn't about the money they lost by not distributing the film. It was about the precedent it set. If Gibson can make $600 million with a traditional Christian story without our approval, what stops others from doing the same? How do we maintain control over which stories are told and how they're told?" The decision was clear. Make the personal cost so high that others think twice before following that path. The real question that emerges from all this story isn't why Hollywood rejected The Passion of the Christ. That answer is clear, because the film represented an existential threat to the secular narrative that Hollywood worked decades to establish. The real question is, why is Hollywood so afraid of the gospel? Why does an industry that celebrates transgression, that constantly pushes boundaries, that proudly challenges taboos and conventions, why does that same industry tremble before a direct presentation of Christ's suffering and resurrection? The answer lies in the nature of the message itself. The gospel isn't just another story among many. It's the story that judges all other stories. It's the narrative that exposes all other narratives as incomplete, as inadequate substitutes for the fundamental truth about the human condition. The gospel says we're broken and need to be fixed. Hollywood says we're fine and just need affirmation. The gospel says there's an objective moral standard outside ourselves to which we must conform. Hollywood says we're free to create our own standards and that moral judgment is oppression. The gospel says suffering can have redemptive purpose when accepted in union with Christ. Hollywood says all suffering is unjust and must be eliminated or at least numbed through pleasure and distraction. The gospel points beyond ourselves to a Savior who comes from outside to rescue us. Hollywood points inward, saying the Savior is within us, waiting to be discovered. These aren't superficial differences of opinion. They're fundamentally incompatible worldviews. And when The Passion of the Christ presented the gospel unfiltered, without apology, without softening, it forced a confrontation that Hollywood wasn't prepared to face. Because deep down, everyone knows, everyone feels. The gospel message carries an authority that no other narrative possesses. Hollywood promised it could fill the void left when they expelled God from the cultural narrative. It promised that stories about human heroes, about self-discovery, about romantic love, about social justice, could provide the meaning and purpose that religion used to offer. But decades after that promise, we're seeing its fruits, and the fruits are bitter. Anxiety and depression at epidemic levels. Suicide is one of the leading causes of death among young people. Chronic loneliness, despite constant digital connectivity. Nihilism disguised as intellectual sophistication. These aren't random coincidences. They're the predictable results of a culture that systematically rejected the only story that truly satisfies the human hunger for transcendent meaning. And The Passion of the Christ exposed that hunger in a way Hollywood couldn't control or contain. That's why the rejection was so complete and the punishment of those involved so severe. It wasn't about the film. It was about protecting a cultural lie that's crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions. The story of how Hollywood rejected The Passion of the Christ becomes even more revealing when we examine what happened after the film's resounding success. You would expect that, after such a massive return on investment, studios would rush to replicate the formula. After all, Hollywood is an industry that lives off sequels, remakes, and imitations of anything that works commercially. When a superhero movie succeeds, 10 more appear. When a low-budget horror explodes at the box office, dozens of copies emerge. But after The Passion of the Christ earned over $600 million with only $30 million in budget, what was Hollywood's response? Deafening silence. Yes, some low-budget Christian films began to appear in the following years, but almost all came from tiny independent production companies, not from the major studios. And even those independent films faced tremendous difficulties getting wide distribution. Mainstream theaters often refused to exhibit them, even when public demand was clear. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of this entire saga is what's happening now, in 2025. Mel Gibson is producing the sequel to The Passion of the Christ, titled The Resurrection of Christ. Filming is scheduled to begin in August at Cinecittà Studios in Rome. Jim Caviezel will return to play Jesus again. And 21 years after the original film, the same resistance is resurfacing. Sources close to the production report that Gibson is facing the same obstacles he faced in 2004, but this time amplified. No major studio wants to touch the project. Banks that normally finance film productions are hesitant. Insurance companies are charging exorbitant rates. Special effects companies that work on practically every Hollywood project are finding excuses not to get involved. It's as if an invisible blacklist is operating, a coordinated boycott that's never explicitly declared, but that everyone in the industry understands and respects. And Gibson, now 69 years old, is again financing the project, mainly through his own company, Icon Productions. He learned from the first time. He knows he can't depend on Hollywood to tell stories that contradict its dominant narrative. But what has changed is the intensity of cultural opposition. In 2004, social media barely existed. Today, cancellation campaigns can be organized and executed within hours. Protests can be mobilized instantly. Pressure on distributors and theaters can be applied in ways that were impossible 20 years ago. So Gibson is preparing not just to make a film, but to face a cultural storm that will likely be even fiercer than the first. And he's doing it knowing that even if the film is another massive box office success, the personal and professional consequences will be severe. Why would anyone do this? Why voluntarily enter this battle again? The answer lies in what Gibson said recently in his interview on Joe Rogan's podcast. "I really believe in these things completely. It was an honor to make the first film, and it will be an honor to make the second, no matter what it costs." That's the fundamental difference between someone who's simply making entertainment and someone who's fulfilling what they believe to be a divine calling. Gibson doesn't need to make this film. He doesn't need the money. He doesn't need to prove anything professionally. He could easily spend his remaining years in relative peace, away from the spotlight, enjoying his family and fortune. But he's choosing to enter the arena again because he believes the story of Christ's resurrection needs to be told with the same intensity and authenticity that the crucifixion story was told. And he's willing to pay the price for it. This isn't madness, it's faith in action. What can we learn from this extraordinary story about Hollywood rejecting the Passion of the Christ? First, that true power in culture isn't financial, it's narrative. Those who control which stories are told and how they're told exert influence over how people understand reality, morality, and their own purpose. Hollywood wasn't worried about losing money by rejecting Gibson's film. It was worried about losing control over the cultural narrative. Second, that there's a real cost to telling the truth in a culture that built its identity on comfortable lies. Gibson paid that cost. Caviezel paid. Everyone involved paid. And those preparing to make the sequel will pay again. But they're willing to pay because they understand that some truths are more important than personal comfort or professional success. Third, that spiritual hunger cannot be satisfied with secular substitutes, no matter how sophisticated or well-produced. Hollywood spent decades trying to fill the void left when they expelled God from the cultural narrative. They created heroes of all kinds, told stories of human redemption, explored themes of sacrifice and love. But nothing satisfies like the real story. Nothing touches the human soul like the genuine gospel. The Passion of the Christ proved that. Millions of people, many who hadn't set foot in a cinema in years, came to see because they recognized something that had been absent from all the other stories they'd been told. They saw truth without filters, without shame, without apologies. And they responded not because they were manipulated by clever marketing, but because truth has its own power. Truth resonates at a level no fiction can reach. Fourth, that the battle for culture is fundamentally spiritual, not political or social. We can point to studio executives, film critics, activist groups, but they're just visible manifestations of something deeper. As Gibson correctly identified, quoting Ephesians 6:12, "We don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." The rejection of the Passion of the Christ was a manifestation of that spiritual battle, and the resistance to the sequel is another. Those who understand this reality aren't surprised or discouraged when they face opposition. They expect it, and they prepare for it through prayer, community, and unwavering commitment to truth. Fifth, that God often uses what the world rejects to accomplish his purposes. Hollywood rejected the Passion of the Christ because it thought it could suppress the message. But that rejection forced Gibson to make the film independently, which ironically gave him complete creative control. If a major studio had financed the film, they would have demanded changes, softenings, concessions. The final film would have been compromised. But because Gibson was forced to do it alone, he could make exactly the film he felt God was calling him to make. Hollywood's rejection became a blessing in disguise, and the film's massive success, against all predictions, became a powerful testimony that when you remain faithful to truth, even when it costs everything, God can use it in ways you never imagined. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, this story reminds us that truth always emerges, no matter how powerfully it's suppressed. Hollywood used all its institutional, financial, and cultural power to ensure the Passion of the Christ would fail. And it failed spectacularly in suppressing it. The film not only survived the opposition, it thrived because of it. Each attack, each negative review, each cancellation attempt only increased public awareness and curiosity. Truth has that quality. The more you try to suffocate it, the more vigorously it emerges. And now, 21 years later, with the sequel in production, we have the opportunity to witness that pattern again. The same forces that tried to destroy the first film will try to destroy the second. But if history is any indication, they'll fail again. Because you can't kill a message that comes from God. You can delay, you can complicate, you can make it costly for those who carry it, but you can't eliminate it. The truth about why Hollywood rejected the Passion of the Christ is simultaneously simpler and deeper than most imagine. It wasn't about money, commercial risk, or cultural sensitivities. It was about an industry that built its empire on secular narratives, realizing that one story had the power to expose its entire structure as empty. It was about principalities and powers recognizing a genuine threat to their influence. It was about light entering darkness, and darkness desperately trying to extinguish it. If these revelations awakened something in your spirit, Demonstrate it by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing in the comments how you perceive these cultural and spiritual battles happening around you. Your testimony may touch the heart of someone who urgently needs this message. How do you see Hollywood's rejection of authentic Christian films? Do you recognize the patterns we discussed operating in other areas of culture? Join our community of truth seekers and continue with us on this journey of spiritual discoveries that can change your life forever. The battle continues. Truth remains. And those who have the courage to defend it, despite the cost, are on the right side of history, both temporal and eternal.